Hi guys, as someone said, my name is Nomzamo Zondo. I'm an attorney at the Socio-Economic Institute in South Africa. Our main areas of work, we work with communities who are facing evictions. We've done a lot of work in the last 3 years, but starting from 2006, where we defend communities who have been evicted in the inner city of Goldberg and sometimes also in the informal settlements and in the townships. What has happened is that we've had, since 2006, been developing jurisprudence where the law basically says that you can't evict someone unless there's somewhere else for them to go. So in situations where you're dealing with vulnerable communities where people are unemployed or they earn very little, we've been able to force the state to provide accommodation. Unfortunately, the state hasn't responded to that obligation. So there's an obligation, they understand that they have an obligation to do this. But in the last 4 years, they've only moved one community. It's about 100 people out of thousands which we have created. We continue that work, but what they've done as well is that they've now put up a solution where they say they'll house these people in transitional housing, where what they'll do is house them in conditions where they are living in dormitory segregated rooms, where they are locked out during the day, and where children, of course, are split from their parents. And at the end of a 6-month period, your time is up, and you must go somewhere else. So we're in the middle of a challenge where we challenge on the basis that, firstly, we know South Africa, we're about 40% unemployment. People who are employed are still earning below minimum wage. In fact, one of the unions there says that you have about 44% of the working population earning below $1 a day. That's one part of the work. We also then work with informal settlements where we try and get them basic services like water, sanitation, electricity. In South Africa, we have a very good legal system. There's definitely legislation that protects the poor and puts a lot of obligations on the state, but there isn't much action. So we also have policy, for instance, for informal settlements, there's an informal settlement upgrading policy, which provides that the settlements must be upgraded into formal housing, and there's money set aside for that. But the local governments or the cities are not applying to use that money. So even today, we had a matter in court where we applied for the city of Goldberg to upgrade an informal settlement, and they are opposing the application, even though what they do is actually ask someone else to give them the money, and then do it. I'm sure you guys are thinking I'm in the wrong place, but the reason that we're here is that SERI also does work for trade unions. We represent, in these 2 cases that we're working on, which should have to do with labor rights. We represent a very small trade union in the Western Cape, close to Cape Town, where it's an abattoir, and it's a big company, but the company is paying minimum wages, in fact, much lower than even the minimum wage. And what they've done is, the moment workers decided to revolt, they were locked out of the premises. That was over 3 years ago. And during that time, once they were locked out, the union they tried through private attorneys to challenge the lockout. And unfortunately, they ran out of money. And after about a year, they approached SERI for assistance. And we've been representing them in the labor court to try to get the workers reinstated. And the company has been using the legal processes to shut us down, and they've raised every possible technical defense they can in order to ensure that we're being tied out. The most recent stunt has been to demand that SERI is made liable for their legal costs in the case that we lose. They're saying that because our clients are poor, if we lose, they'll get nothing. We're in the process of challenging that, but also the reason why I'm here today is because of the Marikana massacre. I don't know how many of you have heard about it, but on the 16th of August in 2012, police killed 34 miners. And I'd like to just go back to how this started. So somewhere in early 2012, few miners were in one shaft, got together and decided that they are the lowest paid within the mines. They are called RSDOs. They dig in the mines. They said, we're the lowest paid here. Let's get together and go to management. All of these workers were represented. They were in a trade union. They were represented by Yoon, which is a very old trade union. It's over 20 years old. It's also one of the biggest affiliates of COSATU, which is the main federation in South Africa, which is the Council of South African Trade Unions. And others were in a newly formed union, which is called AMCA, which is the Association of Mine Workers and Construction Unions. So what happened was that the workers said, because we're in 2 different unions, we don't want to talk through our trade unions. Firstly, because Yoon has always been aware of the problem and they did nothing about it. but also because they felt they would have more of a unified voice as workers themselves. So they approached management. Management said, we understand. We know that you are the least paid in this union, but also even across our competitors, because they work for London, at Anglo Platinum, at Impala Platinum, the workers in London were the least paid. And they said, you know what, we understand. We'll take your complaints to EXCO and hear what they have to say. By July 2012, there'd been a decision by EXCO to give an allowance to the workers. So they spoke to the workers directly and they offered them this allowance of about 750 rand, which is $75 now. But then the allowance never actually came back down to the workers, so there was this promise of an allowance, but sometime later there was nothing. So workers then started to get together and they said, you know what, as it is, we're just one shaft. Let's organize mine workers in all the other shafts of London, and let's come together and actually challenge our living, our conditions. Let's actually fight for a living wage. And they agreed that they want to fight for 12,100 rand as the living wage. So what happened was that when that happened, the workers started actually going from one shaft to the next, and they decided together that they actually got to go on strike without the two different unions. But on the first day when they approached Lodman, they were told, we cannot talk to you, we can only talk to the union. And they were referred then to NOM, which was the majority union at the time. When they went to NOM, NOM basically chased them away, and 2 workers got shot by the trade union officials of NOM. And that was on the first day of the strike. After this happened, so on the first day of the strike this happens, on the second day, it's generally quiet, but while the workers are now marching towards where they were going to meet, they run into security guards. These security guards shoot at the workers, and there's an altercation, and 2 security guards die in this altercation. And then there's, and I think it's generally quiet for a day or so, and then another worker dies along the way, and then on the 13th we have an incident where there's again altercation between police and workers who are striking. In fact, the workers are marching to a shop where they've heard there's workers who are working while they're on strike. And while they are marching, they run to police, and police say, you know what, you have weapons, you must give these workers over to us, and if you do that, we'll walk you to wherever you're working. And the workers say, we understand what you're saying, but we don't feel safe. We've already been attacked by NOM. We don't feel safe just handing over our workers to you. We just ask you to actually walk with us to where we're going, and then we'll be fine. And for some reason, some policemen, we don't know if it was a mistake or if it was a command, but they threw tear gas at the workers, and they threw stun grenades. There's chaos erupts, and everybody runs in different directions, and during that time again, there's people die. In fact, 2 policemen die and 3 workers die in the process. And then the next 2 days, nothing happens. It's dead quiet. But now, between all of this, what happens is that one of the shareholders at London, Cyril Ramaphosa, who's actually a founding member of the National Union of Mine Workers Group, phones the Minister of Police and says, you know what is happening here is criminal. These workers must actually come off the mountain. What then happens from what is unclear is that there's a complaint by this shareholder who's a former activist, a former trade unionist. On the other side, NOM itself writes a letter, even does a press release, where they say the police must shut down the strike. So what then happens is that the police themselves somehow decide that on the 15th of August, say the next day, the 16th of August, is D-Day. And there's a press conference in the morning and it said, today is D-Day. All these workers must go. The workers on the other side, on the one side there's the other smaller union at AMCU, and their president is trying to actually get the workers to come off the mountain peacefully. So you know what, the way things are going, I think it's a big bloodshed. I think guys need to actually come down and let's find other ways to resolve this problem. Now, whilst that is happening, there's clearly a decision by the police to break a strike at whatever cost. What we didn't know then is that in that morning of the 16th, the police had ordered 4,000 rounds of live ammunition for these 3,000 workers who were on strike. They ordered mortuary vans who come and pick up dead bodies. they'd already, of course, gotten the medical care ready for emergency medical care. This was in the morning before the shooting actually happened. So at 4 in the day, then these police shoot out and kill 18 minors. And you can see one, I think maybe people might have seen that on the news. And then later they actually go into the mountain and find people who have gone out, because they ran away because they were so scared of the shooting. And they kill another 16 minors. And then what has happened is that after that incident happened, we had the strike continue, and there was eventually a resolution where there was an increase of the minors, but they didn't actually meet that demand of 12 hours back in the back. But then what happened as well is that there was at the time when there was a suggestion that we might have a state of emergency because of what was happening. But by the beginning of September, the president said we'll have a commission to inquire to actually find out what happened. We've been involved in SERI. We've been representing the families of the deceased minors. We represent about 36 families, so there's 34 that died on the 16th of August, but there's also 3 minors that died on the 13th of August. So we represent 33 of the minors that died on the 16th, and we represent 3 of the ones that died on the 13th of August. We also then represent others. Now, what has happened in the Commission of Inquiry is that we've actually been able to uncover that part of the justification of the police killing the minors, or at least their reason for acting the way they did, is that their intention was to deal with the stoppage of economic activity, and which was a problem for us. I mean, it didn't make sense for the police to come and break a strike. Police are there to actually maintain public order, not stop a strike. They've also made it clear, in fact we found out as well, that part of their reasons was that they didn't want any of the minority parties or opposition leaders to gain political advantage out of the strike. And the police were working hard to ensure that the governing party is shielded from what happened, from what happened in the strike. As things stand, we're on day 220 something, I think it's 28 of the commission, and we feel that as SERI, so at the very least, we've been able to uncover most of the truth of what our clients need to know. And we've also been able to turn back the opinion, public opinion, because I think in the beginning, when the massacre had died, people basically understood that, no, you know what, these were multi-craved savages, they deserve this. If it wasn't for them attacking police, they would not have died. The amazing thing is that this has always been the theory that minors attack the police, but we have 36 minors dead, but there isn't even, on the day, there wasn't even a policeman with a scratch. None of the policemen actually got hurt. But their version, their theory of what happens after they were attacked by the minors, and they had to defend themselves. As things stand now, we're almost at the end of the commission. By the end of 2014, the commission will be over. But we think that in wrapping up the commission, we actually want to lay a basis for London's liability in the role they played as the employer. It was clear that EXCO had put strings to make sure the police had been there. They put strings to ensure that the strike was broken. And in fact, in the beginning of the strike, when the police were trying to get them to speak to us, they said, we don't know these people. These are faceless people. We don't know them. And if at the beginning they'd been willing to negotiate with us, they said that they were willing to negotiate with them earlier in the year, we would have had what happened.
Thank you. Feels kind of weird to go after and describe what Mel was after that. No worries. Hi everyone, I'm Haeyoung with the National Employment Law Project. We're a national legal policy workers' rights organization, and we work primarily on policy development and work in collaboration with both labor unions, worker centers, policymakers to really make reform both at the local, state, and federal level. So a lot of the work we do, sort of just to give you a sense of what we do, and also the law students in the room who will still be in law school next year, encourage you to sort of join us as interns. So we work on, so the core of our work is really talking about low-wage immigrant and unemployed workers. And we work on two fronts. One is to making sure that there aren't, sort of really trying to address barriers for workers to enter into good jobs. So things like, criminal background check, that may be a barrier for workers to enter and get a good job and move up in the ladder. we focus a lot on sort of improving the quality of low-wage jobs. And so we've been doing a lot of work around minimum wage, and we had a huge win in Seattle, where we finally got the highest sort of wage rate at the city level. So we work on minimum wage. Yay, Seattle.
How much is it?
$15 an hour. So that's actually, I'd love to talk about it throughout today, sort of what that means and, whether that's enough or not. But so minimum wage and living wage, we work a lot with the sector organizing, so supporting a lot of the sector organizing that's happening across the country, from domestic workers, restaurant workers, retail workers, fast food workers. And there's been a really sort of vibrant movement across the country of really, and some of it sort of Walmart workers are on strike this week, fast food workers went on global strike a couple of weeks ago, so we are sort of supporting them on a number of different fronts of policy development, communication, sort of research. We also do sort of the bread and butter issue of also the NELP is really thinking about how do we strengthen and improve labor standards. So really talking about what are the reforms we can make of the existing laws that's in place, both at the local, state, and federal level.
So I didn't introduce myself, I apologize. So my name is Goldberg, and I'm not a lawyer. I do a lot of work with the workers' movement here in the United States, mainly the low-wage workers' movement. Haeyoung and I do a lot of work together. I do have an academic credential, which is I just finished my PhD in cultural anthropology at the CUNY Graduate Center, and my research is focused on domestic worker organizing here in New York City with Domestic Workers United, which is an organization of Latina and Caribbean nannies, house cleaners, and elder care providers here in New York. And we'll probably talk about this over time. It's a campaign that Haeyoung provided sort of the key leadership role in on a policy level. So I'll save that particular thing, but my academic work is really secondary to the political work of trying to support the growth of the emergent sort of independent workers movement in the United States through education and sort of political education training work, writing, and sort of just support for many of the organizations that are out there. So I work closely with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which is a national federation of organizations, which Yashna Hadamsi also works for. There's also an organization called the United Workers Congress here in the United States that's a federation of many of the low-wage workers organizations, so domestic workers, taxi workers, guest workers, day laborers, farm workers, many of the restaurant workers, workers who don't have access to the traditional rights that are assured to many workers, to sort of the mainstream unions in the U.S. The union movement in this country goes hand in hand with sort of framework of labor rights that many workers, low-wage workers in particular, workers of color and women workers don't have access to in the U.S. So the United Workers Congress is a federation of organizations working to find new ways to organize. And I also work in an organization called the Roosevelt Institute that does the Future Work Program, and we do work to develop a new policy framework for workers' rights for the 21st century. So that's who I am, but I think between sort of hearing the work that all of us do, in some ways the work is, right, the Marikana strike is both at a level of popular mobilization and at a level of the extremity of violence profoundly different than what's happening in the United States. But what is parallel in both cases, and would be true as well if Bhairavi was here and Alejandra, the structure of work is changing all over the world. I don't probably have to tell this crowd about globalization, the rise of transnational production, multinational corporations, right, the reorganization of the labor process in the world, which also means two things: that the framework of workers' rights that is developed internationally doesn't fit in the same way. It also always constrains the rights of many workers. So the third development is that worker organizing is changing around the world. And so the Marikana workers are stepping outside of sort of some of the established methods that have developed in South Africa since the end of apartheid. Yeah? And the low-wage workers that Haeyoung works with are stepping outside the traditional models of worker organizing in the United States. And so as different as the phenomenon are that we're going to be talking about today, they're contextualized, all of them, both by the changing nature of work, but also by workers breaking outside of the bounds of the previously acceptable. And you have two of the incredible lawyers that are working, right, to help workers figure out how to deal with the legal implications of that. Yeah. So we're going to get into that a little bit more. Mainly by starting with this question, maybe stepping back from some of the specific examples to talk about what's happening with work and workers in your country. How is work being reorganized, and what are some of the constraints on workers in each of your countries? Is what happened with Marikana, is that an exception, or is it a pattern in terms of what's happening with worker organizing in South Africa?
I mean, there's generally, right now, there's a bit of a problem. Nazmiko's here, so maybe we'll make a contribution later. But there's been this challenge that, I mean, we went from apartheid, where the ANC was championing the rights of the poor and the rights of black people, to having them in government. And in them being in government, unfortunately, the poor and workers being left behind. So the challenge is there has been that COSATU has always been married in this alliance with the ANC and the SACP. And COSATU being a labor confederation has found itself in a bit of a conflict where they're like, am I in alliance with the ANC or do I represent the ANC? So for instance, even taking the example of Marikana itself, COSATU couldn't actually come out clearly and say what you've done is wrong and you must be dealt with. In fact, they had a press release where they focused on counter-revolutionaries, as opposed to them saying what happened can never ever happen again, and your hands must go. Even today, within COSATU itself, what happened in Marikana has played a role in a possible split, because there's the issue of this was one moment in time where the lines were drawn, and it was you had workers on this side, you had capital on this side, and with all the history behind us, COSATU had to make a choice. The ANC government had to make a choice. Where do you stand? And unfortunately, at that time, at that crucial time, they stood with the capital. Now, unfortunately, COSATU, I don't know if they're in some deep sleep or what is going on, but they seem to want to hold on to the relationship that they have with the ANC, which has been the reason why, for instance, a lot of workers are feeling that they're not being represented, they're not being protected by COSATU, which is the biggest federation, which most of the workers actually fall into COSATU. As we speak, there's the biggest affiliate of COSATU, Nomzamo, in the last election refused to support the ANC. And that was in itself, it was a big question, will there be a split? And they're saying, we carry lunch boxes, we stand with you to carry lunch boxes. These people stand with the buses, we will not go. There's generally a problem, and in all the organizations, and even if you look at student politics, there's this issue of if you support ANC, then there's this dilemma of how do you support the government at the same time stand for the poor workers? Or in the same way that, first, the amazing thing about South Africa is that we have all the laws, we have great policy. We can actually, if the government was responsive, would actually be able to deal with those things. We have minimum wages, for instance, for domestic workers, we have minimum wages for farm workers. But I promise you, less than 20% of workers in those areas actually earn minimum wage. Some of them earn half of that. When the government is there, they could actually enforce a minimum wage. So there's definitely a problem. I mean, I would really like to speak to you guys, because for instance, South Africa, we don't have organized workers in domestic workers, are not organized. Taxi workers are not organized. They're just apart, and that is, I think, one of the reasons why they are so exposed.
Could you talk about these sort of questions about the different kinds of worker organizing that's happening today?
Yeah, so maybe I can sort of also just add to what Harmony was saying in terms of the changing nature of work, but just I wanted to begin with saying, I think inequality is really intensified in this country, and I know there's much more of inequality that is talked about in the popular discourse, but just wanted to kind of put out some numbers, like, so 1 out of 4 workers in private sector get paid less than $10 an hour. And about 52 million workers in this country make less than $28,000 a year. So that's the frame. And then, large transnational corporations like McDonald's, for example, reported $5.5 billion in profits, and their CEOs are making over $13 million a year, right? While, fast food workers are really fighting and demanding $15 an hour. So that gap between what a CEO makes of these multinational corporations versus the frontline workers are making, that gap has really widened. And so that we have, what we're facing in this country is a really the sort of the crisis of low-wage jobs. So coming out of the Great Recession, the growth of jobs we've seen in this country is primarily being low wages, fast food, retail. So these jobs that are making, barely minimum wage. So I think that's like one context of what the constraints are that workers are facing. So there are workers that were in low-wage jobs and the growth of these low-wage jobs, but then we are also still battling unemployment, right? So we still have about 9.8 million unemployed workers in this country, and over 3 million of those have been in long-term unemployment, which means that they've been out of work for 6 months. So these numbers, I think, give a context of what the constraints are, but also some opportunities for worker organizing, which I hope that we will talk about. I think I would sort of talk about 3 other things. Like in terms of the changing nature of work, I think there's been a really growth of contracting out, outsourcing, subcontracting jobs, which means is, as some people call it, the distancing, the relationship between the frontline workers and the employer, who is ultimately responsible and shaping and controlling the wages and working conditions of those low-wage workers. As that relationship is distant through these contracting out, right, the workers are much more in exploitive working conditions. There's been a disaggregated work as well, again, continuing to that. The people who are ultimately responsible for the wages and working conditions and can really set standards are really distancing themselves, allowing the middleman to really control the standards. The other sort of really important and critical piece of this country is the lack of comprehensive immigration reform. So we have about 5% of our labor force is undocumented workers. And because of the lack of immigration status in this country, there's a culture of fear in workplaces. And there is, as workers are out there trying to organize and assert their rights, employers are using immigration enforcement to really kind of chill and suppress that effort. And that's, until we solve that problem, it's a huge, it's something that we are really grappling with in terms of worker organizing. And lastly, I would say the failures of our legal regime. So the National Labor Relations Act is the regime under which workers are able to collective organize, bargain, and so forth. So this law has been gutted, and it's also that it's, it reflects, that regime reflects of the economy of 1930s when the law was enacted. And because of the changing nature of work and the workplaces and global economy, we are really in need of a new model to how workers are engaged in collective action, how does the law really support workers in motion? So that's some of the, I think, the more exciting and opportunity work that's out there that a lot of the independent worker centers are engaged in. And I would just say that you raised sort of like a lot of these low-wage sectors are not getting, minimum wage, and I think that's the other sort of the constraints is that there's a huge amount, wage theft in this country is an epidemic, right? And that undocumented workers and women undocumented workers are sort of at the bottom of in terms of the most explosive.
Yeah, I think, yes, that would be wonderful. And I just want to pull out of what you're both saying. I think it's important when we're talking about the law and the role of legal activists in supporting worker organizing to pull out some of the points that were underlying what you were both saying, that there are questions of the structure of the law and does it work or not, right? In South Africa, you have a good structure of the law, you have a non-enforcement of the law, right? And so in the US, we have a pretty bad structure of the law and a non-enforcement of the law. But in both cases, right, even when there's a good structure and it's not enforced, the question of the power of capital, right? Whether it's because of the reorganization of production and the consolidation of multinational corporations, or just the sort of unfettered right, power of mineral capital in South Africa. It's an important question, and so sort of pure debates about the law, when we're talking about work and wealth and inequality, a lot of it comes down to the question of power, right? Not just right and wrong, but a question of power. So maybe saying that, maybe you guys could talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that you see in worker organization.
there's something that Haeyoung said that I wanted to talk about. I mean, one of the biggest campaigns of labor in the last 5 years in South Africa has been this issue about the outsourcing and labor broker. So, for instance, in last year, the postal service workers actually managed to take out the middleman completely. And part of, after I think a very long strike, what they were able to do was to actually get the government to say, we'll no longer have third parties acting as employers in the postal service. But it's a problem that is there across the bound in different sectors where we have these people who actually do nothing, but they come there and they say, we've given you a job and we'll take 30% of what you're supposed to earn. And a lot of people who work in those outsourced arrangements earn very little, and a lot of them are in like cleaning services. A lot of the universities in South Africa actually maintain or service through these organizations, and you find that universities, which are supposed to be progressive, are allowing this exploitation to happen under their own nose and with their own money. The other thing was on this issue of collective bargaining. We've had two fronts. On the one side, there's definitely power in being together. But what the capital has been doing is that the smaller businesses have been complaining to say, but I can't have a minimum wage, or I can't agree on the amount agreed by this big, by McDonald's maybe, or I can't, because I make so little. And it's actually gotten to a point where, on I think one of the very few occasions where the government has even said, well, this is actually what has been agreed in this sector, and this is what you pay in this sector. We're sorry for you. The other thing is on the issue of power. I mean, in South Africa, it's the role played by social movements has been very important for work organizing, also then supporting them. So you find that, I mean, public opinion plays a huge role on how long a strike lasts. I mean, as we speak now, the workers were on strike in 2012 on strike again. They've been on strike since 23 January 2014. They haven't had a single sentence salary for the last 5 months. But because of organizations, because of activists like you, we've been able to put out a strike fund where these workers are actually getting food, and they're actually able, at least at the very least, to feed themselves. But they've said, as the workers, that we are going forward. We can go hungry, but we're not going to sit in a situation where the value of our labor is so little that we can afford to support our families. We'd rather have a situation where we suffer now, but at least at the end of the strike, we'll actually be able to support our children, be able to take our kids to university, be able to have access to proper health care. Those things.
It's a question to Nomzamo. My name is Mazubu Jaha. I'm from South Africa. Several questions actually. My own view is that basically contract labor, the companies that hire contract labor, the only way it can end really is if workers literally chase out these people in workplaces. So anyway, that's mad. Then another question is, again, you mentioned it, the minimum wage for farm workers and domestic workers, that is in law. But over some 9 years of the existence of such a law on minimum wage, government basically was linking it to the low inflation rate, annual inflation rate. The only time that there was a real victory was when workers actually broke law and actually fought for 3 months as farm workers. There's some interesting echo for me there. Is law enough? Because actually what you've seen is employers going out in a big way to bypass even the minimum basis that the law has set. So when those farm workers literally banned the farms and so on, that's when government actually gave, I can't remember the percentage figure now, but it rose from about 75 rands per day to 112 rands per day now. There's a minimum labor, which was the biggest proportional increase ever in the history of some 10 years of this minimum wage. Thank you. Sorry to be so long.
But the unfortunate thing is that the fact that we have so much unemployment that people are generally scared to stand up for themselves. That's the honest truth. So as an organization, as SERI, we believe that we're there at the very least. If something like this does happen, then you know there's a place where you can go and you can get legal support. And we've always been alive to the fact that law doesn't have the power to change everything. But at the very least, people do rise up If, for instance, you get arrested, that's already happened to me once. If you get arrested, then someone's going to be there to go and bail you out. But even on a point of training, when you understand, for instance, when you can go on strike. I mean, in South Africa, they don't call them unprotected strikes, they call them illegal strikes, which is actually a legal fallacy. There's no such thing as an illegal strike. It's unprotected. But the discourse is in such a way that you always understand yourself that if you stand up for yourself, you're doing the wrong thing. That it's important that as lawyers, as activists, we actually impart some of the knowledge of the law. I mean, as this week, something totally unrelated, but I think it's important. It makes the point. There was an eviction in Cape Town where over 100 families were evicted. The city of Cape Town, which is run by the DA, which is the opposition party in South Africa, said they're not going to accommodate these people because it will mean that these people are jumping the tube. But the law is very clear that if people are going to become homeless, the state is obligated to accommodate them. But that community didn't know that. You know? And unfortunately, it meant that in the middle of the South African winter, children were homeless and were sitting outside, freezing cold. A child was killed while the police were trying to forcefully remove people from this area. So there is definitely the issue of education. So as lawyers, we have to educate the population on what the law says. And in South Africa, I think it's very important because the law is so variable.
Thank you. I think it's an important question, this question of is the law enough? And maybe we can end, like, what role does law play in relationship to the process of building worker power? And I want to come back to that. I really briefly, actually, on this contract question.
Yeah.
Haeyoung, could you talk about some of the work that workers are organizing around and some of the ways you are trying to push the boundaries of contract?
Yeah.
Law and also contractors?
So I think, well, one, just to kind of like, in the context of so subcontracting, outsourcing, it isn't anything new. It's been around for decades, right? But we definitely seen the rise of it. And I think the thing that we sort of grapple with in the US right now is like, how do workers take power and win against an employer like Walmart, right? Walmart is the largest private employer around the world, right? And you know, I think they posted like 17 billion profits last year, while I think the frontline workers are getting less than $12, or, you know, I think they're demanding that they should be entitled to at least $25,000 a year. So I think the contract, and then Walmart is really kind of, I know that Walmart is seen as like a retail store, but they're sort of started out as in the logistics company. And so they're a key player in creating and perpetuating this subcontracting and contracting out and outsourcing. So I think that we're grappling with that in the US of how do workers, you know, build power and how do they go up against Walmart. And I think there, it can't just be a solution in the US. I think the problem to solve the contracting out has to be a global solution, right? I think that, you know, I've heard some people say that Walmart is not what it is without the workers in China, for example. So, and I think that's something that we've been trying to grapple with and work on. And there's a number of sectors, from guest workers who are brought in from abroad to work in these contracted situations. So for example, I think some of you may have seen, maybe last year or 2 years ago, there was a group of students who come on a cultural program called J1 visa, where the purpose of that program is that people are supposed to come from abroad, college students, who are supposed to come and exposed to cultural experience in the US, right? And then part of that program is that they're working. But the jobs that they were basically packing boxes at Hershey's factory in Pennsylvania and getting less than minimum wage, or living in a very crowded housing where at the end of the day, because of all the illegal deductions, they were basically making less than minimum wage, right? So that's the situation where we're finding ourselves of workers, you know, are in that situation. So workers are trying to organize, like, so the guest workers have done a lot of incredible work of organizing guest workers to really assert for their rights and really demand that they get paid basic wages. There are also workers there's, you know, history in the US of janitorial workers organizing and establishing industry standards and so forth. But the thing that we're working at now, and we're working in collaboration with a lot of some of the groups on the ground, is trying to figure out to hold more entities in the sort of the supply chain responsible for what is happening to the sort of the lowest rung workers in that supply chain. And it's something that we are really interested in experimenting across the country. But so that is a shift we're making with a clear recognition that, you know, there may be some limitations of the law where the law itself isn't going to be enough to win. And so these legal reforms are great, but I think that, you know, what needs to accompany is different strategies outside of the legal arena for the workers to be exercising power and really really push the law reform to happen.
And if I can sort of build on that. So in the US, I don't know, how familiar are people, raise your hand if you really feel like you're familiar with union rights in the National Labor Relations Act in the US. Okay, good. So, just checking, because it's easy to, I don't want to repeat things that people know. So the National Labor Relations Act in the US, it was passed in 1935. Like Haeyoung said, it was built along the structure of the industrial economy to ensure workers the right to collectively bargain with their employer. Right? You worked in a factory, you were given the legal right to form a union, and your employer was legally required to recognize the union if you won a majority vote. So in the US, subcontracting, I can't speak for other places, so like just to break it down in a simple way, and we can see if it's similar to what's happening in South Africa. Subcontracting means, say you take a building, I'm going to use janitors because it's a good way to play with the law versus worker organizing because of what janitors in the US have done. You have a building, right? 100 janitors, say, work in this one high-rise. In the past, it would have been one employer, right, that all of those janitors work for. Now those buildings have been broken down, so there's 10 subcontractors, right, and 10 workers per subcontractor. The building is no longer responsible to recognize a union of all 100 employees, right? You only have the legal right to bargain as 10 workers with your direct contractor. Beyond that, labor rights don't actually protect you. You don't actually have a right to unionize in a bigger way or in a different way. You're only legally protected for the right to unionize with respect to your direct employer. Now, janitors in this country, this is decades old now, so old story.
30 years.
Yeah, 30 years, but we still haven't figured it out in the law, which is why I think it's important. Right? Janitors said, we don't care, right? We're going to organize this whole building, and we're going to run a public campaign shaming the building owner and forcing the building owner to negotiate with us, right? Because that's the person who really sets the standards here. The contractor, he or she doesn't have any power, usually he, right? Doesn't have the power to actually raise our wages that much. They're trying to get a bid, and they have to bid down to the building owner. So they're bidding down to get the contract, and then that's driving wages down. So the person who's actually responsible is the core employer, is the building owner, right? So we're going to target that building owner. And people probably might remember this, maybe some of you are too young, right? Janitors went out and stopped up freeways, stopped up downtown Los Angeles, freeways in DC, San Francisco, all over the country, right? To shame these building owners using community pressure, right? And the building owners sat down and negotiated when Haeyoung said the janitors set industry standards. They set standards for all the buildings in a downtown area at the same time by publicly shaming the building owners and saying, we don't care what the law says. The question is not the law, the question is worker power and workers' ability to organize and challenge the employer, right? So they went around the law and won a contract. The law hasn't caught up, it's 30 years later, right? There's still no law that says that workers have a legal right to unionize with relationship to that building owner, even though most of the economy is now, or these growing sections of the economy are now structured that way. And so I think and so lawyers have been trying to push, and I think now recently has been playing an important role in arguing the law should be restructured, so that if you set the terms of employment, if you're the building owner, you're setting the terms of employment. Even if you're not the legal direct employer, you're setting the terms of employment, wages and hours, so you're responsible. Right? And so workers are allowed to bargain with you up and down the supply chain. That's not the law yet, but it's a good idea. Right? And so that's a model that came from the organizing, right? 30 years old organizing. They were like, old story, old story, but the law isn't there yet. And so I think as we're sort of talking about this, is the law enough? I think is an important question. And I think probably we would all answer no, right? because really the process is driven by worker organizing, but then in that context, what role does the law play? So maybe I can use that to frame, like, what role do you all, this is not one of our structured questions, but in that kind of context, what role does the law play in supporting worker organizing in this context where whether the laws are there and aren't working, or we need a new framework for laws? What role does the law play specifically?
I mean, as SERI, we have we do a lot of advocacy as an organization, not just on the issue of the law, but we understand that our role as lawyers is always exactly on that issue of saying what happens then. I mean, it's unfortunate the law has not caught up. But what we do is we make sure, for instance, when the janitors actually get arrested, when it happens that, for instance, there's a small area where we can actually just make a loop, right? So in a situation where, like exactly what we had with subcontracting, is that you have the situation where even though you have the building owner who has a subcontractor, when you appoint a second subcontractor, that subcontractor must take these people over. But if something happens with that subcontractor, the building owner is responsible. And that was from the development of the law in the courts, not necessarily in legislation. And that's part of the strategy that we can try to use.
So, I mean, I think that in the U.S., you all know this as law students, we're taught in a certain way to think about what the law is, right? And we're taught in a certain way, how reforms happen. And there is, no doubt, incredible value in thinking about that. I think my experience of sort of having gone through the legal schooling here and then being out in the world doing the work is that, yes, I think we're quick to say there are limitations to the law, and there's, again, no doubt that there are limitations to the legal regimes that we've inherited, right? And these are important regimes, the National Labor Relations Act, despite its limitations and the way it's gutted, the spirit and intent of it is important, right? It is protecting workers to go out and engage in collective action and support them as they are trying to bargain with their employers to have better working conditions and therefore build power. In a similar way, the Fair Labor Standards Act set the sort of the floor for what, wages that workers in this country ought to be paid. I think what has happened is that there's been the gutting, right? And that sort of is the sort of the employers, and then as part of the global economy, really sort of the 1% in this country are really sort of setting the standards of how workers ought to be, right? And that workers are not, we haven't been able to build enough power to kind of fight and win. And on the sort of the wage context is minimum wage was an incredibly important concept, right? And the notion behind that was it's the floor and that people can get and should be paid above that. What has become in this country is that has become the maximum wage. So right now in this country, $7.25 is the maximum wage that workers are entitled to get, right? So in the relationship to the law, laws are important, but there are these limitations. And I guess there are two things that I've been sort of thinking a lot about is because we work on minimum wage, so institutionally we're really invested in it. But I think that we're clear both internally and this is what I want to share, is that we really need to fight beyond that sort of minimum wage, right? We're sort of in this battle to increase the federal minimum wage for $10, right? But that alone isn't enough. Seattle was a huge victory, and there's no question what it took to win that. But $15 is actually not a living wage still in this country. So we really need to push the boundaries of that law, and that law reform is incredibly important, right? As much as there are limitations, that the reform could actually make and improve the material conditions of workers' lives, right? And I think that law reform can facilitate worker power building, right? So this is something that Harmony and I have been sort of grappling with, and we're trying to figure out is are there any ways that we can use legal models, hooks, policy models that we can build at a local or state level, possibly at a federal level, at some point down the road, that would explicitly facilitate workers to organize, build a base, and build power, so that they have enough power to really set the terms and conditions of their wages and working conditions of their each workplace, but also industry as a whole. So I feel like those are some of the opportunities where the lawyers, right, can play a critical role in supporting workers to organize, build power, but really think innovatively and creatively and think outside of the box of what you've been taught at a law school, to like demand bigger things and ask for bigger things and think about new models. That is not about tinkering with a provision here or there, but really outside and think big about a different concept, a different framework that can support worker organizing. So I feel like there are limitations, but there's huge opportunities. And then I feel like as we sort of talk about it, we're, in some ways, workers are writing a new story, a new narrative about what this country will be, what democracy is, what power building is, who's going to be really the driver of the economy in this country. And as they are, incredible in terms of workers in motion, whether that's fast food workers or the Walmart women workers, Walmart workers who are protesting at their shareholder meeting this week, as they're out there in terms of in motion, I think the lawyers, we have a role to play in figuring out that the policy and the law reform could be the legs to give like real detail to that vision of a new kind of economy, new kind of power, new kind of democracy.
I mean, the story of the Marikana, the current strike where the workers are, is for us exactly that inspiration. Where the workers have said, we earn 4,000 rand now, but we want to earn 12.5. And we don't care how you make it work, but we want, and they're not even saying 12.5 before tax, saying when I go to the ATM in the morning and I look at what I've earned, I want to earn 12.5. And of course, they've been attacked for they're being told you're ridiculous, this is impossible. But at the same time, during the strike, the CEO of it's Anglo Platinum was given bonuses, and his income for the year was 257 times what the worker was earning. And his response when he was asked in a press conference, say, but how is it that you can earn this bonus while there's this strike? And he says, but I've earned this. I deserve this. I'm not on strike. I deserve this. And he had to actually come around and say, okay, I'm sorry, I was insensitive. But unfortunately, capital decides that as much as it can get for itself, and then they say the workers comes. And it's important for the workers to define their own value, outside of what economics tells us should be their value, outside of what the media tells us should be their value.
So I know you've had your hand up, so I want to give you some space.
Mismanagement of resources and a long view of history over the last 500 years or so, processes that have been put in place to make the globalization that we see now, and using kind of climate debt to address, as a form of reparations, basically, to the third world. And so me personally, I'm just interested to see how labor fits into this equation. So just getting a sense of where the struggle is, or as we said earlier, walk toward fire.
I would say, just to go back to the question around like what are the strategic sites for fights, I don't know if there's definitely not one place. I think I'll speak for myself and where I am and sort of the work I do and what I see in the U.S. context is that, outside of the organized labor movement, I think the rise of the worker centers and the fact that their organizing models, as Harmony was saying, is that the worker centers come out of a particular history and communities, right? I don't know how many people are familiar with sort of the rise of worker centers. Should I sort of say a little bit? So, there's probably hundreds and hundreds of small, varying size of, local worker centers that could be statewide. And then probably in the late 90s, I think there there's been sort of, as the movement sort of grew, there's been a federation of different worker centers around sectors. So like taxi workers are organized both domestically but also internationally. Domestic workers are organized both domestically, but then they're also part of an international network. Restaurant workers or Restaurant Opportunity Center in New York sort of federated, and it's sort of a national alliance. Day laborers, for example. So I think there's been this increased capacity in a federationizing, but the worker centers really come out of community-based groups and immigrant communities where, and there's a long history of racism within the trade union movement in this country. But work, so trying to meet the needs of immigrant workers, in particular geographically in different communities, and then really trying to take a holistic approach of what their needs are, and coming to worker issues, worker organizing, right? And so, and then sort of the movement, I think, as it grew, realized like the sector-specific, industry-specific organizing was a very strategic way to build power. So I feel like, and the sectors and the worker centers are organizing in many of the growth industries of our economy, right? Retail, restaurant, care workers, right? So I feel like in this country, those are the strategic sites to support the organizing that's happening, right? And I think that obviously that's also done in collaboration with the unions. And there's just been a lot of sort of, the other one thing that I would note is that, we're about to, in this country at least, do another shift in terms of how workers will get organized, because we're waiting for this particular decision to come out from the U.S. Supreme Court. They may actually, that we are forced to think about how we organize in the public sector in this country. So I think there's a potential for some shift happening, and again, another probably a sign of strategic opportunity.
In South Africa right now, there's this huge debate going on about shelling, because we don't have for the mining of gas, and we have huge unemployment. There's this issue that environmentalists are going up saying that this is not good for the environment. There's going to be a lot of water wastage, and people are saying that people need jobs, and it's very, very important that we link up the different struggles so that we don't make the wrong decisions. So people are just saying we need jobs. Who cares about what happens to the water? On the one hand, but we actually do need to have social movements who are actually make sure that all these, whatever choices we make in the different sectors, give us the best overall. And that's why I really can't say where you should be, because what's the best place to be, because wherever you are, you definitely need it.
If I can just throw in a thought, introducing myself as a panelist, versus moderator. I think there's huge opportunities that I don't actually know enough about in supply chain organizing internationally. I do think it's an important front. I think the fact that labor law, I can mostly speak from the U.S., that labor law and employment rights are crumbling is a huge threat to workers' rights. It is also a real opportunity. And in particular, it gives us a chance to rethink the framework that we have in this country. It's not an inherent one, where we have this incredibly poverty level of the minimum wage and other kinds of social protections far below other industrialized nations, the floor in the United States. And everything else has been supposed to be dealt with through collective bargaining, through the National Labor Relations Act. So if you want above a poverty wage, you better form a union through this particular method. Now, the National Labor Relations Act has been undermined in itself for the workers it was even supposed to represent, and there are many sectors of workers who were left outside of it. It's crumbling, it's falling apart. It's terrible for the working class in the United States. It's also an opportunity to revisit that division, right? And I think what workers are doing in the United States, in particular a lot of workers in the informal sector, is pushing the boundaries on what we expect the state to provide for workers in the US, right? Again, before it was like state ensures a very minimal poverty level. Workers are saying that's not okay anymore. The state should assure us a quality standard of living, right? Which before people were like, stop saying that, you're supposed to unionize. You want that, go unionize, right? We're saying no, every worker in this country has this right. which is actually a much more progressive framework for workers' rights and labor law. It creates social solidarity, much more likely, right? When you organize workplace by workplace, there's a power, you're directly confronting your boss, that's very important. In the United States, work is incredibly segregated. So if you're organizing workplace by workplace, you're organizing in segregated terrain. It's part of why white male industrial workers were able to run way downfield, and workers of color and women workers in this country were left pretty far behind. And so the fact that it's crumbling is terrible for the working class. It is also an opportunity for the working class to really revisit the framework of rights that we have in this country in a way that could actually transform the labor movement and make it much more potentially radical in this country. So there are,
you know, we've seen in the history of the United States, but around the world, the workers' movement really leading liberation struggles generally. And I just was wondering, you know, at where we're at right now, what do you see is a way for those of us working with movements organized around other issues? What is sort of the best way, what is your thinking or your advice to give us to really connect the struggles given you know, Haeyoung, that you said about, especially about how like what workers are pushing for is not just a new way of working together, but it's also a new way of conceptualizing our democracy. And I think that, you know, I think that speaks to a lot of different issues. And where do you see our places that we really should be coming together that we're not?
Really, the law can be like a placeholder for vision often, but is not looked to as like what's actually going to be happening in a given society, whether it's South Africa or in the U.S. And the key is kind of finding the things that are going to increase solidarity and initiative for working people, to, whether it's the miners or domestic workers in terms of their ability to organize, and to put the kind of visions that the law has for how society should work, but actually implement them from their own perspective. In terms of those things that maintain solidarity and initiative in your organizing, what do you see both that lawyers can do to support that coming from workers, as well as things that have been useful? Like, why did the miners decide to go on strike at that time as opposed to all the other times that they've been screwed over? You know, like how do you, there's no one formula, but like what are some things that as lawyers we can kind of look to know when to be more attentive to workers' demands?
Okay, I mean, where I work, we haven't really used any of the international mechanisms, but we've used the international law a lot to kind of color what our law should be. I mean, with the Marikana Commission of Inquiry, we have the injured and arrested miners, so the guys who survived the massacre. Those guys are not getting funding from the state. We had to bring a legal charge, we forced the state to fund them. And the international law definitions play a huge role in the success that we had. I mean, as we speak now, they are being funded. Even though the problem that we have generally in South Africa is that they are being funded, but they have actually gotten the money. So there's a court order. But the government is just giving all sorts of reasons why you were supposed to sign this form, you're supposed to do this and do that, and you haven't done it. I mean, generally the problem for us in any event in South Africa is that there's really this issue of the courts are willing, you know, the courts are running with us on some important issues. But when we've gotten to, we have our highest court, the Constitutional Court, we have an order from the Constitutional Court, but getting enforcement of that has become the biggest issue. I mean, in most of our matters now, we are bringing contempt of court proceedings against places like the city of Goldberg, where we say, okay, if this doesn't happen, the mayor must get arrested. And of course, at the end of the day, the courts also now of course, they've been running with you all this time, but they don't want to say the mayor must sit in jail for 60 days. They're not going to do that. So then you now also go through a process of negotiating. So you have an order, you're supposed to enforce it. But now, instead of enforcing it, you have to sit and now negotiate about actually doing what they should have done 4 years ago. On the issue of worker organizing, I mean, the interesting thing in South Africa right now is that the biggest COSATU affiliate, Nomzamo, is trying to start a social movement. And they are saying that we can't just organize in the workplaces. Our problems are much bigger than that, and our struggles are linked. You know, in South Africa, for instance, housing is an issue. So if you earn 4,000 rand, you can't get a bond to get a house. So even though you might be fighting about how much your wage is, you can get 4,000 rand, but it's not going to get you housing. Or it's not going to get you education, or quality education, or quality healthcare. That's why it's so important to organize more in that way than to say we're just going to fight about what our labor is. I mean, the opposite also means for the one thing about us keep saying about the Marikana strike is exactly like they said. It doesn't matter. I mean, when we in South Africa, there's this thing that there's a culture of entitlement. So when you fight for housing, when you fight for healthcare, when you fight for access to education, you're told you have a culture of entitlement. And when you go and organize, people are told, why should you do it for free? No, you must pay. And you're like, I can't pay because I don't have the money. That's why I'm not paying. And the workers are saying, it's fine. We're not going to fight about that. We'll fight about the value of our labor. We'll withhold our labor and see what happens there. And that's why this platinum mines and shit. Because for 5 months, I think in the beginning they were kind of like, we're fine. We've got more money than they do. They're going to struggle a lot more than we're going to do. So it's fine. But now in the 5th month, they're working on budget. And they're in trouble because they think, okay, now this is actually going to affect our profits. In fact, for the first 4 months, they were using stocks that they'd saved. So they were kind of like, no, not concerned. We're still just selling off stocks. We're fine. But now they actually get to a point where they have nothing to sell. And there's no production. And basically there's a proper economic stoppage. There's nothing happening. And that's, I think, for us in South Africa, where miners are migrants who are supporting people in rural areas for food, for even sanitation. I mean, in South Africa, you have, for you to get a proper toilet in the rural areas, sometimes you do it yourself. So they need their money for those sort of things, the basic things. And that's why you actually do need to just link all these things together.
So on the question of international law, we just haven't been using it that much. I mean, we've tried it now, and we supported like the domestic workers actually participated in the ILO, and they sort of for the first time, passed the convention on domestic workers. I think the challenge, I'd say the challenge on 2 fronts is one is that within the legal community, things are so siloed. So the folks who work on international law don't necessarily engage folks who work on employment or labor. So we need to be better at that. But I think the other reality is that how do you implement something like that is a real challenge, because when US don't sign up for a treaty or an agreement, it's hard to kind of move beyond that. So I think that's the challenge. But I do feel like there's a lot of great sort of conceptually that we can learn from international law, the way ILO conceptualizes forced labor, for example, or guaranteed hours or guaranteed income. Like, I feel like there's a lot that we can learn. But I don't think it's about trying to take that and then, replicate it. I think we have to kind of take it and then sort of figure out how to move it within the US context. On the global supply chain question, I feel like Walmart is a really good example of, and for a while I was obsessed with we have to kind of answer the Walmart question, and I know a lot of folks, especially the USCW folks, are grappling with this. But Walmart is a very good example of how the global supply chain works, right? So there's also the Walmart stores, where there's also the frontline workers in other countries, but then just to use an example, let's say, production happens in China, right? It comes to the US, the ports, right? There is, and this is a level of contracting out before it gets to the products are delivered and packaged and placed on the shelves in Walmart. There's many, many layers of people and subcontracting. So clearly example, the merchandise arrive at one of the ports in the US, right? The workers, the truck drivers who will carry that to their stores are misclassified as independent contractors when they should be employees of a company, right? And so, and then, let's say that maybe I can start from the Walmart because that may be easier, sorry. So the Walmart hires a logistics company to carry their merchandise from the ports, right? That logistics company turns around and hires another firm to manage that work, and then sometimes that's another layer firm turns around and hires a temp agency to hire a group of temp workers who are storing merchandise in a warehouse, right? The product is then I was saying about the truck drivers, they're misclassified as independent contractors when they should be employees, or drives the merchandise to a warehouse, it's stored, and then there are these layers that finally ends up. So I feel like that's a clearly global supply chain, right? And then there are folks who are sort of really trying to figure out how do you unlock that? How do you organize workers across that supply chain? And there's been some work around trying to have, warehouse workers, for example, with Walmart workers to guest workers who may be involved in sort of, working in the warehouse along with the U.S. workers. So there's been some efforts, but it's challenging. I think it's challenging for a lot of different reasons, but that's a clear example of where I think the global supply chain, the possibilities and the opportunities are really real. And in a similar way, I think the fast food workers were trying to do that, because there's all these there's the frontline workers, but then there's a whole layer of franchised McDonald's, for example, and Burger Kings that are sort of subsidiaries or franchise of the parent McDonald's. And so there was some efforts to try to bring all of them together as well. And this question of I don't know if this is the right question, but how do you bring different struggles together? I think the one place that I've been thinking a lot about in the US context, and I think we are trying, is in the context of immigration reform in this country, where, there are very distinct movements, right? There's the immigrant rights movement that sort of leads with a certain set of issues, right? And I think the labor and workers' rights movement have been part of it supporting that, and really kind of see immigration reform not just as an immigration policy, but also as an economic policy in this country. And I think and the women's movement have been really supportive of immigration reform, LGBT and Asian, so I think that's been one place where we've been making that efforts to come together and really make together, try to make that push. But obviously we've been faced with some challenges on that front. But I do feel like immigration reform in this country, we are in desperate need of another immigration reform. I feel like we've had immigration reform in this country every decade, right? We had a bad set of laws passed in 1986, and some good things because people got legalized, and then we had a bad set of laws passed in 96. And we were due for a reform in 06 and 07, and we didn't make it. So come 2013, 14, I feel like we really need it. And I feel like that's a movement, that's a site of struggle that I feel like all the movements in this country can come together, because we really do need to answer and unlock this contradiction that we're facing in this country. And the last sort of question around, how do we sort of work with the workers? I feel like there's this debate in the legal community as lawyers, are we technocrats and providing technical assistance only, or are we more of a strategic partner and a strategic thinker along with workers or different communities? And I feel like we really need to shift how the legal community thinks about who we are. Yes, we are no doubt technocrats, right? We have a certain set of subject matter knowledge, and all of you will develop subject matter expertise, whether that's environment or immigration reform or labor, whatever that may be, that moves your hearts. But I think we have to go beyond being technocrats, and we really have to be a strategic partner, and that is really thinking beyond. And really sort of at this question is what does it really mean to support when workers are in a fight of their lifetime, right? And to sort of think about, being a strategic partner is, you can contribute on the strategy of the, organizing campaign, but also really be innovative and creative and be bold about what is the law reform that you can put forth that will really support them and help them. So I feel like that's where our best contribution ought to be as lawyers.
I mean, for us, let's say, when Marikana happened, it's not something that would be expected to get involved in. But we were so outraged, and we felt like what happens is that the massacre happens. A few days later, the workers get arrested for murder, for murdering their colleagues who were shot by the police. And you must understand that As things stand, in our papers, if we tell the police killed, no, they didn't kill them. The miners were not killed by the police. I don't know who killed them, but they were not killed by the police. The police shot someone. Now, at the end of last year, we had a situation where the city of Goldberg basically went in and they had what they called Operation Clean Sweep, where they sweep the street of informal traders. They removed informal traders off the streets brutally. There was assaults, there was goods confiscated, there's people who got shot in that. Now, as Syria again, we were like, we work with housing banks. You know, if we get go back. No, but these are our climatic areas. This is what we do. It was like, there's no time for that. There's over 6,000 people who are going hungry right now because of the unlawful actions of the city. We have to do something. And we basically just like sort of, I remember I just forgot everything else. I just zoned in on the city of Goldberg and on informal traders. And at least within, I think, about a month, they were back on the street trading. And they're supporting their kids. And that's something we say, you know what, we responded to this crisis. And it worked. And of course, we've now formed relations with them. And we're supporting them going forward. So there is that, we're not set in stone to say this is what we do. We are, as Haeyoung said, we're strategic partners. We're here to support the working class. We're here to support the poor and marginalized communities. And we'll be there when we're needed, when we're needed.
Not thinking ourselves as working in a box, but thinking that when these struggles come up, as social justice lawyers, we will run to the fire, right? I feel like, at least in my work, and I know many of my colleagues have felt this way, is that there's a tension between this idea of working in that with that approach, but then also feeling like, are we overstepping our roles, right? We're lawyers, we're not the organizers. Where we may come from that community or we may not come from that community, but there is this additional sort of privilege or bubble or something around us because we are lawyers. And when are we overstepping our role, and when do we need to actually be working with partners? I just wanted you to talk a little bit how you deal with that.
And I sort of, my own personal thinking has evolved over the years on this. Like, one, I feel like it's about building trust and relationships, right? And when you're working together, and that may seem kind of an easy and simple, but I feel like that's a really challenging work of how do you build trust, and how are you really like an ally, and what does it mean to stand in solidarity, and how does it mean to support? Like, I think we throw around the word support. I mean, that is probably the sort of the limitations of our language, but like, I feel like we have to really kind of break down and flesh out what that support means. And so I guess where I am now is that I'm less concerned about these quote unquote boundaries of like, you're an organizer, you're a lawyer, you're stepping my bounds. But it is really like, what is the sort of the, so I feel like we get so bogged down by that. And it is real in a campaign context where there is a litigation, there's workers organizing, there are real tensions, right? And this is the way I think legal systems impose. And I want to be real, like as lawyers, we are actually maintainers of status quo. Like I have no illusions about who I am as like, if I'm wearing a lawyer hat, I maintain the status quo, So there are real tensions, like in the context of like organizing campaigns where there's litigation happening and workers are organizing, and those need to get worked out, right? And so I don't want to dismiss things like that's easy, because those are real, and because there are certain, when you sign up as a lawyer, there are certain obligations you have, but those need to get worked out. Those are details, and I feel like those details kind of get blown up as like you're overstepping your boundaries as an organizer, as a lawyer, whatever. So I feel like I want us to push away from that. We have to work those out, but then really kind of think about what is supporting me and what does it mean to be a strategic partner in a way that doesn't box us in as like you're an organizer, you're a lawyer. And it is really sort of the ultimate goal. Like, how do you win, and how do you change the material conditions of workers' day-to-day lives, and how do you support them through their day-to-day sort of struggles? And I feel like you will know that. I mean, I don't mean to be like kind of like goofy or like whatever, but it's like, I think you have to kind of figure that out as a lawyer. like, and you have to kind of be thrown into that sort of conflicts and work it out and figure out and make mistakes and, you know, but engage people, right? Engage organizers, engage workers, and so you will figure out what that balance is. And I think that is the trajectory of every lawyer. You start out, it's a huge learning curve that you will have to do when you go out and you decide to litigate, what that means, and if you decide not to litigate, you have a different trajectory. But like that path, there's a lot of sort of huge learning curve to happen. I would say first 5 years that you're out practicing or being a lawyer in the world. And you'll have to kind of figure out and struggle with that. But not be afraid to make mistakes, I would say, and try and experiment and, you know, and bring all of your heart and your sort of innovative thinking and ideas to it, because if you hold back, actually people who lose out is you as a lawyer and your own sense of what that means, but also like what you want to support.
I mean, I've been in this area of law now for like only a year, so it's like I'm not even 5 years yet. And I told myself I'm not going to worry about it. Because part of the reason why I decided taking this job is because I am an activist. So I'm not going to worry if I'm like overstepping the bound or not. Because the reason I'm here is because I'm an activist. So if I'm going to worry about, if I shut Amanda now, this is going to be a problem, I'll spend too much time thinking about it instead of actually doing it.
You'll not be a judge so long as the ANC rules.
I don't care. And that's the honest truth. I mean, for me, I mean, I understand that this thing that you must balance. At this point, I'm just doing it.
If I can, I think like in a lot of your questions underlying to me sort of expose one of the things that I think we struggle with in the U.S., which is that we don't actually have bigger political spaces that transcend our individual job or individual sector. And this plays out for organizers, for lawyers, for academics, right? We sort of talk a lot about this a lot with the nonprofit system. You get in your silo, you work on your issue, like how do we connect the issues becomes the way we have to think about it, because it's the way we're structured to get funding and we're taught to be effective, right? Lawyers, you develop an expertise in an area of work and like you have to go that way. Like, feels like with you all, you have to decide like first year of law school what you're going to be. It's kind of crazy. And I just think in the countries you reference, right? Countries with national liberation histories, or when there was a powerful workers movement in this country, people had a shared vision, right? Some of what John was referring, a shared vision that went beyond the immediate issue and the immediate struggle in South Africa, right? A series of organizations that people belonged to, whether it was the African National Congress or the South African Communist Party, that gave them, and like when it was years ago, I can't say us, because it was like 80 years ago in the United States, there was a much anymore, and I think the Nomzamo workers in South Africa are bringing that tradition alive again, where they're like, we're workers, but we also live in our communities. We're also our parents to school children. We are all those things because we are the working class, right? I think there's a range of ways that could be cut in different contexts, but I think that some of the answers that seem really complex are actually really easy, and so I feel like we need to reinvent invent new things. There's actually old answers to them that need to be developed out in new ways, but that we need political spaces that are radical political spaces that allow us to actually develop this vision of what the ruling class is up to, what is happening to working classes from different nations, right? And how we build unity and solidarity, like I think, and how we are comrades together in the struggle, right? We are all activists, we're all comrades, and if that is the case and we share a vision, then each of us can bring our full selves and not be worried about squashing each other, right, based on privilege, because we have a level of political unity that doesn't mean we pretend that the individual privileges that we have don't exist. It's just that they, in the absence of having that shared vision and that shared sort of strategic approach, we end up dealing with sort of much more individualized manifestations of it, so much more. And so I just think the more that we have those spaces, whether that's political organizations or just conversations, even at this point in the U.S. in history, like, it's a real low level. Like we can just talk to each other. I think a lot of these questions work out a lot easier. So I know we're past time, yes? So maybe we can thank our panelists and again send good thoughts to our missing panelists. Thank you guys.